Greek and Roman Architecture by Tammy Zambo. A lasting influence. In today's fast-paced world, people are constantly encountering new objects and improvements in technology that offer possibilities they have never considered before. Some aspects of life, however, are not based on the new, but on the old. For example, the United States is a democracy, a form of government that was first developed in ancient Greece. Likewise, many modern languages are based on Latin, the language used in ancient Rome. The architecture of buildings around the world today also reflects the lasting influence of ancient Greece and Rome. Architecture is the art and science of designing and erecting buildings. A culture's architecture tells a great deal about the way people live, and in turn, the way they live shapes their architecture. Greek temples. The ancient Greeks worshipped many deities. To each one of these immortal gods and goddesses, they built and dedicated a separate temple. The temples were not houses of worship like the ones we know today. Instead, they were considered to be the places where the deities stayed when they visited the earth. A temple was a god's or goddess's house, and a statue or other image of the deity was the temple's main occupant. People visited temples only on regular festival days and at special times when they wanted to ask for a deity's favor. Many temples had altars outside where these visitors could leave small tokens or portions of food as an offering to the deity. The Parthenon is the best-known Greek temple. It stood prominently on the highest hill in Athens, the Acropolis, where many other temples and sacred buildings were located. The Parthenon was dedicated to Athena, the goddess of war, wisdom, and crafts. Athena was also considered to be the guardian of Athens, and it is for her the city is named. Because Athena was the most important deity to Athenians, the Parthenon was the largest temple in the city. Athena's sacred space. The architecture of the Parthenon reflects how temples were used in the golden age of ancient Greece. The outer part of the temple consisted of a portico, or porch, with an impressive Doric marble colonnade, or row of columns, around all four sides. Inside this colonnade, a shorter row of columns appeared at each end of the temple. Next was the cella, a vast interior chamber with four walls made of stone blocks that were joined together with metal clamps. The cella was divided into two rooms. In the main room, a wooden statue of Athena rose 40 feet, 12 meters, into the air, and was covered with more than a ton of ivory and gold. A pool of water glimmered at the statue's feet to reflect light from the doorway onto the statue. The smaller room of the cella, in the rear of the temple, was a treasury that housed other statues, jewels, and vases paid as tribute to Athens by the Delian League. Each summer, to honor Athena's birthday, all of Athens held a huge festival called the Panathenaea. The highlight of the festival was a grand procession near the beginning. In the procession, most of the people of Athens would march through the city to the Acropolis along a route known as the Panathenaic Way. In a formal ritual at the Acropolis, they would present a new robe to be draped over a statue of Athena in a temple called the Erechthrium. Then a ceremonial feast would be held. Every fourth year, the celebration called the Great Panathenaea was bigger still and lasted 6 days. This festival began with poetry and music contests, followed by athletic contests, called the Panathenaic Games, and other contests held over 5 days. The great procession and feast took place on the 6th day. The design of a Greek house. The Mediterranean climate of Greece is warm most of the year, and the Greeks' houses were designed with this in mind. Most houses featured a central courtyard with rooms on at least 3 sides, and possibly on an upper floor as well. The rooms usually had only small open windows with wooden shutters, because the Greeks valued their privacy. Baked clay tiles covered the roof, allowing rainwater to fall from them evenly. The houses were designed so that the courtyard was shaded and cool during the many hot months of the year. Some also had a balcony over the courtyard that was open to the air, but had a roof, so that it always provided shade. The courtyard was a gathering place for the family. The house also contained an indoor altar, where the family would pray daily and present offerings to the gods and goddesses. If a house was large enough, certain rooms were designated specifically for women, and others were for men. This arrangement reflected the fact that men and women lived very separate lives, and women did not socialize publicly with men. One of the primary rooms in the house was the andron, or dining room, where the man of the house would entertain male guests. Because the Greeks ate while reclining, they often used dining couches rather than chairs. The andron was designed with a low platform around the edges to hold several dining couches. The first theater. One of the ancient Greeks' most important contributions to later civilizations, including ours, was the performance of plays, as well as the theater structure itself. The first plays were performed in the agora, but as they grew increasingly popular, performances were moved to a slope of the Acropolis, which naturally formed a kind of semicircular auditorium. At first the audience sat on this slope in wooden seats and looked down on a bare central area that became the stage. Later, the seats were made out of stone, and a wooden framework behind the stage was erected for hanging scenery. Actors could also climb onto the roof of the framework to perform certain scenes. This framework was called a skene, from which we get the word scene and scenery. The most famous Greek playwrights were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Many of their plays resembled modern-day musicals because they included a chorus of 12 to 15 men. All of the speaking roles in a play, including female roles, were played by just 3 men who had to change costumes often. Architecture advances. The Romans copied many features of Greek art, including the architecture of their temples and other buildings. The Romans, however, developed innovations in building materials that made new building designs possible as well. One of the most remarkable buildings in ancient Rome was the Pantheon, a temple dedicated to all the gods and goddesses. Like Greek temples, it was built with a portico supported by columns. Its cella, however, used a completely new building design. It was round, and it was topped with a massive dome. At the very top of the dome was an opening called an oculus. The dome represented the heavens, and the oculus represented the sun. The round room and dome in the Pantheon were made possible because the Romans invented concrete. The Greeks had used wood, different types of stone, brick, and marble. When the Romans blended stone or brick with water, lime, and volcanic earth, the product was much stronger than other materials. This concrete allowed the Romans to build stronger arches and curved roofs called vaults. These techniques could be combined in a dramatic way to build structures such as the Pantheon. Architecture at home. Only a wealthy family could afford to live in a Roman house called a domus. The center of the domus was the atrium, or hall, with an opening in the ceiling over a small pool. The atrium usually held a lorarium, a shrine dedicated to the household gods. Surrounding the atrium were the triclinium, or dining room, furnished with dining couches like the Greeks used, the kitchen, and a study. Bedrooms were located either off the atrium or sometimes on an upstairs level. Rooms next to the street were often rented out as shops. Windows were small. In the back of the domus was an open-air garden surrounded by a colonnade, called a peristyle. The walls of a domus were often painted in intricate patterns, and the floors might be decorated with beautiful mosaics. The house might even include a latrine and running water. Most Romans didn't have houses but lived in crowded apartment buildings called insulae. Many insulae were several stories high and poorly built, with wooden frames and floors that often caught fire. They had large windows, but sometimes these provided light for the whole building. In time, laws limited the number of floors an insula could have, but evidence suggests that building owners ignored the laws. The early plumbers. One of the Romans' most ingenious innovations was their system of running water. Using their improved arches and new vaults, they built aqueducts to channel water from mountain springs and rivers to the cities. Gravity kept the water flowing through the aqueducts continuously. Once it reached the city, the water was collected in enormous tanks called castella. A network of lead pipes then carried water to public buildings and to the private houses that had running water. Most people did not have toilets in their houses or apartments, so they used public latrines. Some of these latrines were in bathhouses, facilities that met many needs. Bathhouses were places where Romans could exercise, bathe, get a massage, snack, and relax. Some bathhouses even included a library. The elaborate architecture of the baths featured many rooms and a sophisticated heating system, so that a visitor could bathe in separate hot, lukewarm, and cold pools, or all three in succession. The Circus Maximus. Another popular Roman pastime was attending chariot races at the Circus Maximus, an enormous racetrack. A full day's program at the track included 24 races, foot races, trick riding shows on horseback, and games between gladiators also sometimes took place at the Circus Maximus. In the center of the Circus Maximus was a long, low structure called the spina. It was decorated with statues, trophies, and a row of large movable egg or dolphin-shaped counters that were turned over one at a time at the start of each lap in a race. Built into one end of the oval were 12 starting gates. At the start of a race, a system of catapults opened all the gates at the same moment. Teams of 2, 4, or even up to 10 horses burst out of the gates, each pulling a chariot with one charioteer. The teams raced 7 laps counterclockwise around the spina at top speed. Teams risked crashing into each other, especially on the turns. Charioteers were often killed or injured in such collisions. Many did not survive past their early 20s. The Circus Maximus could seat hundreds of thousands of people. As in a stadium like the Colosseum, the stands were a permanent structure built around the track. Vaulted areas below the seats supported the structure, and audience members climbed stairways in these areas to reach the higher seats. The stone seats closest to the track were reserved for the Roman senators. The poorest spectators had to stand high above the track, farthest from the action. The emperor enjoyed a special boxed seat along one side, decorated with columns, like a small temple. Borrowing and innovating. The architecture of the ancient Greeks and Romans display great skill and imagination. From the temples for their gods and goddesses to their open-air houses, many of the Greeks and Romans' achievements still stand today. Examples of ancient Greek architecture include the Parthenon, the auditorium in the Acropolis, and their houses. The Romans borrowed much of their architecture from the Greeks, as well as developed their own innovations. The Romans' use of concrete allowed them to build dome structures. They also built aqueducts to make the best use of their water and outdoor racetracks for entertainment centers. How the Greeks and Romans lived is reflected in the way they built their structures, as their structures reflect the way they lived.